For more on the tensions between the West and Russia, I'm joined by Admiral James Stavreediss. He's former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He's now the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Admiral, thanks so much for joining us. You just heard Jack Barton's report. Why this move and why now, do you think?
I think it's a direct response to Russia's illegal violation of international law in annexing Crimea. This has very understandably rattled old ghosts in Eastern Europe. When the Baltic states, who were dominated by Russia for centuries, when Poland, which was invaded by Russia, when they look across to what has happened in Ukraine, they're understandably very concerned. So NATO is moving to reassure those allies in the eastern part by doing the things that were discussed in that report. I think it's a prudent move, and in the end is actually stabilizing because it reduces the anxiety on the NATO side of that border.
Okay, you say it's stabilizing, and yet one might say, how does it improve the situation in the region, given the fact that Moscow, not happy about this, they say they may strengthen their own forces and increase the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles to the nuclear arsenal later this year?
Mike, I think, first of all, they have talked about, quote, adding 40 warheads to their force. They have 1,500 nuclear intercontinental weapons today. So 40 is really not a significant addition. Secondly, we're not looking at a thermonuclear war remotely. We're not even in a Cold War. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, and what we have today, while there's a lot of tension, is not like the Cold War, where we had 3 million troops facing each other, the Warsaw Pact and NATO across the Fulda Gap. What we have today is a period of tension that has resulted from Russia's invasion and annexation of Ukraine, the annexation, of course, of Crimea. So when we can reassure the NATO allies in the East, I think that, in fact, is the best way we can reduce tension. It resolves any sense on the eastern part of the alliance that they'll be left hanging if Russia continues to move further to the west. What
about the Minsk Agreement, building on that, looking for a diplomatic solution instead of kind of ratcheting up the pressure on both sides?
The alliance has been extremely clear. The United States has been extremely clear, Mike. If Moscow lives up to the Minsk Agreement, the first step of which is to remove Russian troops from Ukraine, then we would happily accept that situation. That would be the most important thing that could happen. And as we know, there are about 8,000 Russian troops in Ukraine today. That's from the OSCE and from NATO sources. I think that's accurate, unfortunately.
Well, what about those who would argue on the other side that Kiev isn't doing much in terms of opening up the political dialogue with the opposition?
I think that Kiev has been very consistent in saying, step one, and I think this is understandable, step one is let's get the Russian troops out of Ukraine, let's respect the border, and then let's have that political dialogue. I think that's a very rational approach. That's what the Minsk Accord says. Russia has agreed to the Minsk Accord, but as yet, unfortunately, they haven't lived up to the first step, which is removing their troops from Ukraine.
As you know, Putin's been around for a while, been in power for 15 years. Not once has he seen his approval ratings at 89% until now. What do you read into that? Despite all of this, the ratcheting up of rhetoric, the sanctions, doesn't seem like the West is making much of a dent in terms of public opinion in Russia.
I think there's two factors to that, Mike. One is Russian psychology is one that is almost impervious to outside pressure. They tend to revel in it. And if you haven't read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn recently, go back and read it again to get a sense of Russians and how tough they are. So outside pressure can have an opposite effect there. Secondly, it's going to take time before the sanctions really bite, before the fall in the oil prices really impact, and before the reality of the way President Putin is breaking Russia away from Europe sinks in. In the end, Europe and Russia are logical partners for each other. But Russia, under Putin, is becoming this angry, isolated island in the middle of the Eurasian continent. It's a losing strategy long term, and it will catch up with him.
James Stavreediss joining us from Tufts University in Boston. Thanks so much.